Dear all, I want to warmly welcome you for this book launch celebrating Morten Nissen's impressive scientific imprint, Rearticulating Motives, Theory and History in the Human and Social Sciences, published by Springer. I know that you, Morten, are going to present in more details our speakers today. Still, I want to welcome you, Paul Stanner, Professor of Social Psychology at Aarhus Universitet in the UK, for participating in this event, and I look very much forward to listening to your comments and reflections, your reading of Morten's work. Also, I want to welcome you, Katrine Hasse, Professor here at DPU. Soon, we are officially part of a joint department, including both educational anthropology and psychology. And of course, I also look very much forward to listening to your contributions today. Although he's not here, I would also want to welcome Gerald Moore, who is, as far as I know, signing up later. He's Professor of Philosophy at Aarhus Universitet, and unfortunately he could not be here today in person because of cancelled flights. Luckily, he has also agreed to be with us at Zoom later, and that we appreciate very much. Morten, I've known you for like 25 years or more, both at the University of Copenhagen and also Aarhus University here, DPU. You have always inspired and also challenged my way of thinking and doing psychology. I'm impressed and also sometimes puzzled by your insights and overview in psychology, philosophy, art, literature, activism, alternative ways of documentation, technologies, STS, ANT, activity theory, and your way of insisting on rearticulating mainstream thinking, and also your engagement in post-psychology and in your work of cultivating motives for developing motives, and so on and so forth. There is heaps of knowledge in and around you and in our talks. And I've promised not to speak too much, so the list is not at all fulfilling. And as you know, sometimes I can have a hard time getting hold of all your advanced thinking and writing, but luckily your office is just down the hallway over in the D building, and I can pop by and ask whenever I have some questions. I appreciate your contributions and your challenges. Also in our daily life of our soon rather big department, where you also contribute to planning and doing teaching in a very good and competent way. But I promise to do it short, so nice to see you all and a warm welcome. We have looked very much forward to this event, and before I give the floor to you, Morten, I've promised to inform you that this event will be recorded and subsequently put on our website, right? So congratulations, Morten, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Of course, it's not just my own work. A lot of you have contributed in different ways. And that's how it is with texts. So, of course, I'm eager to leave the floor to our wonderful guest speakers. But since there may be a few among you who have not yet read all of my book, I've taken on the task of explaining what's in it in the 15 minutes to come. Let me just add now that you can buy the book for a fortune, but with a deduction if you're attending this. And also, if you're in the university system, you can access it via the library. So find a link in there. Maybe that's better. Anyway, so what's it about, this book? In 2 sentences, Rearticulating Motives is to cultivate meta-motives, that is, motives for developing motives. This is what can perhaps help us escape the hamster wheel better than the horror images of our slavery to an AI that knows our motives better than we do ourselves. In slightly more detail, After a broad introduction, I offer what I call a post-psychology that traces concepts of motivation and motives through various theories. The most important problem around which this imminent critique is centered is that of scientific objectivity. How to make of subjectivity a scientific object, or how to move beyond this contradictory ambition. Here, the concept of boundary objectivity around objects such as energy is suggested as central. Energy is widely imagined as the substance of subjectivity, sliding around the boundaries between the metaphorical and the measurable, between manipulation and identification, between the muscular and the moral. I discuss prevalent strands of positivist psychology, behavior design, cognitive theories, self-determination theory, and then of mainstream traditions. Of the latter, I focus mostly on the Vygotskian or social cultural historical tradition, including its version of critical psychology. But I also venture to find parallels to critical psychoanalysis. When off-mainstream traditions seek a scientific objectivity for their concepts of motives, the idea of biological and social function becomes important, as it configures the necessity of needs, defines pathologies and cures, and translates those into well-known standard activities. This has spurred attempts to overcome such functionalism and the dualism it entails, attempts which then run into troubles with how to think of objectivity. That contradiction, in a way, is the germ cell from which the position of this book has emerged. Chapter 3 proposes a theory with which to understand motives and their representation. After having argued the usefulness of such positive theoretical propositions, I reconstruct the main points of Ude Osterkamp's theory of motivation from 1976. Here she is with my supervisor and some other Danish colleagues from the 70s. Okay, her concept of desire for agency as participation in a general performance of collective anticipatory care promised a way to overcome the dualism of functionalisms without being trapped by the pure negativity of anti-functionalism. But her theory was largely forgotten because of a lack of attention to the question of how subjects and activities are constituted, framed, and individuated, which pushed her tradition into a phenomenological cul-de-sac. So I outline an alternative theory of how care and desire for agency can be analyzed, taking off from those aspects. A dialectics of how we and I are constituted and individuate is proposed as yet another retake of the Hegelian dialectics of recognition. The concept of liminal technology is then borrowed from Paul Stenner in dialogue with a row of other theorists of technology, Stigler, Latour, and others. The technology of text and its representation, or maybe I should say re/presentation, fremstilling in Danish, of activities and motives is highlighted as a fundamental kind. This approach helps us address in a materialist way how activities, participation, and motives are formed as objects and such becomings, as well as how to understand transitional moments of so-called affective indeterminacy. This finally leads to a section on aesthetics as a way of cultivating meta-motives beyond function, with Rancière, Adorno, Greuze, and Vygotsky. Chapter 4 is about counseling, yet in continuation of the previous chapter, the key proposed is to regard activities as always only contingently framed as such. This contingency of framing is a general approach argued as a way to reflect the rearticulation of activities and practices. But it becomes relevant especially when people's recognition as autonomous subjects with reliable motives is at stake, as in the field of addiction, where for that reason practices are developed that address motives directly. The general contours of that field are outlined by a discussion of the two kinds of practice that are dominant in this field: 12 steps, fellowships, and cognitive client-centered counseling. On this background, we move into analysis of concrete prototypical counseling practices performed and endorsed by my collaborators, who were counselors who referred to the tradition of solution-focused brief therapy. This is interesting because it directly opposes the epistemology of objectivity, which was a crucial aspect of motivation psychologies. But my interpretation is that once the frame of counseling is in place, objectivity is hard to get rid of. This leads to proposing aesthetic activities as an alternative route to overcoming the boundary objectivity of clinical practice. Art is more frank about proposing objects as things with uncertain or multiple semantics. In Chapter 5, a more unfolded analysis is presented of practices called aesthetic documentation at U-Turn, a Copenhagen facility for counseling drug users. A general introduction places those practices as prototypical for one way to develop post-therapeutic approaches in this field, and especially for taking up aesthetics as a way to cultivate meta-motives. The specific activities studied in close collaboration with participants are those of a creative writing group. This requires a contextualization in the current cultural revolution of forms and genres of writing and self-writing, in art, self-help and beyond, spurred not least by technological developments. Introduced by a sample poem, which you see there, we then discuss the writing group in dialogue with the writer of the poem before we dive into a recorded sequence of the writing group activity to see how the aesthetic dissensus of poetic presentation works as a form of externalization and generalization that allows meta-motives to be addressed in a caring way. The final, Chapter 6, is about representations of and for care, of which this book is itself proposed as an instance, and about how these carry the competences in care work, as well as make out an important field of concern for care work, a field currently under transformation. As an alternative to the presuppositions underpinning the movement of evidence-basing care work, the prototypical performative nature of texts on care and for care is emphasized and argued, along with how representations of and for care should be understood and cultivated as landscapes of diverse infrastructures, genres, voices, and forms of knowledge, with Bernard Stiegler, neurodiversity. This is demonstrated prototypically with an analysis in progress about and contributing to an ongoing effort to develop a website manual for the care work, parts of which we discussed in Chapter 5. I attempt to place it in intertextual dialogue with textual representations of the dominant approaches to care in the field and to discuss its neurodiverse nature. A final section reflects on how theory, such as that of this book, is relevant to the competence in care as synthesizing dialogical, reflective, and innovative meta-knowledge. How reading theory requires a submission, yet leads to the metaphorical death of the author, and how it overlaps and dialogues with art in the creative poetics of knowledge. A snippet of this dialogue I have discussed with Julia Kordowski, who made these aesthetic representations also. Anyway, the author did not actually die, not just yet. But now the text is in the hands of its readers. In that sense, all the author can do is twist and turn in his grave, or resurrect as a ghost and join the readership as the first, but not the best reader, hoping to learn how the text, with all its imperfections, was much wiser than he could ever hope to be himself. So this was my resume. Now you know all about what's in the book, and we can go on to hear readings of it. And I'm, of course, extremely happy and proud to introduce the very distinguished readers who have agreed to spark off this process.